And on that note, today, very excited to have John Fry. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Christina.
John is the Vice President and Global Projects Workplace at Firmenich. And we have a total of 25 minutes with him to go through his career. And I've had the pleasure of having a good look both at his LinkedIn profile and also his CV. And I always find it fascinating when people have studied something completely different than what they've actually ended up being. And I think Jonathan actually typifies that, where he did a Bachelor of Engineering in Chemical Engineering. So can we start with you and university and why you chose what you chose? And looking back, are you pleased that that's what you chose to study?
Yeah, thanks, Christina. Yes, I do something now very different to what I first trained in, and I suppose I do often think along those lines. Why did I do this, and where has it taken me? I do remember quite clearly when I was maybe about 14 or 15 years old. I was speaking to a friend of mine at school, and he said that his dad was a chemical engineer, which I knew nothing about, and but seemed quite interesting. So I went to that old-fashioned thing called the Careers Library in school, and I did a little bit of research on what is chemical engineering. It suited me in the sense I was very much a science-based boy at school, did maths, physics, chemistry at A level, and so I was interested in the fact that you can do something. I wasn't a great chemist, but I was okay at chemistry, but I was really interested in how you could take chemistry onto an industrial scale and do something with it. I also liked the fact at that stage that chemical engineering was is considered, and was and still is considered, quite a it's quite a I don't mean valuable in a monetary sense, but it opens more doors than it closes. So I took it as a degree that even at the end of it, had I not wanted to do chemical engineering, would nonetheless help me achieve some kind of job that would be useful to me, that I'd enjoy. I consider it a door opener rather than a door closure, if you will. However, my career path, actually, when I left university, I did go straight into chemical engineering on a large industrial scale for ICI, and I used chemical engineering for, I think, probably the first 16 or 17, maybe even more years of my career, and have no regrets about that whatsoever. It's something that and some of the skills I learned post-university in the workplace as a chemical engineer are really useful to me now in terms of understanding. Chemical engineering is about taking what happens in a lab and making it happen in the real world. If you think about projects and working with people, you need to understand what they need from you, and you try and help them translate it into something meaningful today. So some of the skills I learned there have been really useful to me all the way through my career. So I've got, I have a very clear reason for why I did it, and actually no regrets about doing it, because I used it for so long and the skills have stayed with me.
And you touch upon the ICI, and then you moved into Zeneca, and it was a process engineer. So what did that actually involve? Was that actually you in a lab? No, not so much, Christina. It's in most companies like this, the people working in that most of the time are chemists. Okay, so the chemistry happens at a relatively small scale, probably less than 1 litre scale, whereas the engineering and the manufacturing happens at anything from 50 to thousands of litre scale. The process engineer is the person in the middle who kind of takes the lab scale technology and the lab scale chemical operations and scales them up, make sure they work on a much larger scale, and sometimes it's not that proportional. So something that takes 1 hour to happen in a lab may take several hours to happen in an industrial scale. So it's turning laboratory experimentation and laboratory processes into commercially viable industrial processes. Well, for me it was, in terms of, when I think about API and fine chemicals, that's kind of what it means. Oil and gas is obviously a bit different, But the kind of engineering that I did was very much converting the chemical process into a manufacturing process.
Okay, thank you. And then obviously you were at Zeneca, pre the merger is when you joined. And for me, it's always interesting when companies do merge, because obviously there's coming together of cultures, different ways of working, you know, rationalizing headcount. But at the time, I guess you weren't in real estate. Do you remember, you know, things changing? Obviously, Zeneca being British part and Astra being the Swedish one, so two very different cultures coming together. Did it affect you? Because at the time, as I said, you weren't in real estate.
It's interesting when I look back on it, Christina. I do reflect positively that it did, even at the at the grassroots level for people like me, it did feel like a merger. It didn't, it was badged as a merger, and often things are badged as mergers when really they're not. This was badged as a merger, and to me, it felt like one. So I think in the early stages of the AstraZeneca company being formed, there was very little rationalization. Some came later. I mean, we'll be honest, it did happen later, but at the beginning, it did seem like a genuine bringing together of two organizations that had two very complementary drug portfolios that ultimately, generated a large organization that was very sustainable. So I think that in itself it didn't feel difficult to be part of it. I didn't feel as though we're going to be looking for closing sites immediately, and so but to be open with you, some sites did close in the longer term, and some longer term strategic decisions have since changed. But at that point, the first 2 or 3 years, it was pretty stable, and so it wasn't a bad experience to have gone through for me personally.
Mm. And then you left behind a little bit of what was termed in your CV as the process engineering and various other, obviously you got promotions, but at what stage did you then decide, because to me it looked like from the CV it was 2005, 2006, you were moving away from the engineering side and the technical side to more on the FM side. And I'm just wondering, was it somebody who tapped you on the back? Was there a mentor who said, I think you've got this within you, you should try something new? Could you talk us through that?
It was a reasonably conscious decision, Christina. I was working at a site at the time within AZ that was relatively small, 250 to 300 people overall, and with that comes some obvious limitations in kind of how far you can go. So it was a case of, I'll be completely honest, my ambitions were unlikely to be met staying in that location. So if I wanted to progress my career and broaden my career and have more regional or international experience, I needed to do something a little different. FM was not a big leap in terms of it wasn't a stellar leap from an intellectual or a capability perspective. So I knew I would be able to do it, and the role I took was kind of like a business partner. It was almost like an internal business partner. And one of the things I was focused on was how do we best serve our own capital projects needs. So we always used to have this kind of bun fight every year about who would get what capital. And one of the reasons I was intrigued by this role was it needed somebody to coordinate and develop. How do we allocate capital in that kind of capital investment in that kind of environment, which really interested me. So it was simply a case of not being able to achieve my ambitions in the location I was in the role I was in, therefore looking for something a little bit more progressive, and actually, opening more doors than it closes. That was my thought. I figured it was a good opportunity at a good time, and again has proved to be a good decision from my side.
Mm. And did you actually have to take time out and do courses and learn new skill set, or you learned on the job?
No, learned very much learned on the job. So there was I hadn't done anything in the pure play FM area. I was comfortable in the hard service environment because engineering is quite transferable, but I didn't have a lot of experience in the softer in the soft service environment. So certainly had to understand a little bit more about how things are delivered and some of the things that we have to do to keep the lights on and keep places clean. So that was something I did have to learn fairly quickly. But having been within AstraZeneca for a number of years, I had enough of a network to be able to go to find people I need to speak to and develop relationships reasonably quickly. So it didn't take that long to get my feet under the table.
Okay. And then 2012, you become the portfolio director. So away, I guess, from the FM side and much more the strategic side.
Yeah.
Was that a vacancy that had occurred? How did that come about?
Yeah, that was a vacancy that had occurred. I think it was a point in time in AstraZeneca's evolution, certainly within real estate, where the head of real estate at the time was trying to take a much more strategic than transactional view. I think real estate within AZ had for some time been reasonably transactional, and Paul wanted to move it to be a more strategic enabler for the organization, and he recognized that to enable that or to support that, we needed to have a much greater understanding of our portfolio, where the gaps were, where the opportunities were, and where and how we could start to offer things to the business, whether it be consolidation, whether it be lease breaks and taking different spaces. And it was the beginning of bringing together a portfolio strategy based on a kind of like a workplace strategy, so you could start to use one to create another to influence a business. So it was very much a case of moving real estate from being a pure enabler to being something a little more influential and strategic, as you say.
Okay, and tell us a little bit about the highlights of that role. Was there anything that you want to?
I think that the key thing we did, two or three key things we did, Christina. One of the first things was after a period of time, we actually developed and delivered a real report, a proper data-driven report on AZ's portfolio, where the square meters were, where the costs were, and that in turn helped us to focus on where the opportunities were. And this would have been around 2012, 13, something like that. And bizarre though it may seem, AZ did not have a really clear understanding of its portfolio at that point in time. And then you could argue, as a pharmaceutical company focused on, patient health, that's okay. But we wanted to really start to bring to the fore the extent and the cost of the AZ portfolio to the senior leaders within the organisation, just to enable conversations. Really, to say, look, here we've got all these square meters and it costs all this money. Come on, guys. Surely we can. It's a big sum of money. We should be doing something more proactive with it. So that was a big highlight in terms of creating something that hadn't been done before. Albeit it ended up being 25 pages of a piece of paper, but it was really something that was quite impactful. And then I think finally, pretty much the last thing I did when I was at AZ, we were involved in the disposition of Alderley Park, which was the UK R&D centre, which was a huge project from a complexity and a regional politics standpoint. AZ made a strategic decision to relocate UK R&D headquarters from the northwest to Cambridge, with quite significant local impact in terms of jobs relocating, Alderley Park effectively being a redundant site. So we managed to do a pretty good deal with JLL, where the site was transferred to an organisation called Manchester Science Parks, which is under the umbrella of Bruntwood, and Alderley Park is still is now a multi-purpose science park with good tenancy rates. It's really it's involved in the some of the COVID testing protocols that are being developed now. So it has survived really well, and is there's lots of large companies that are now based there. So I think that what could have been a really difficult and damaging decision for the Northwest has actually turned out to be in the grand scheme of things. It's turned into a positive deal where we have lots of employment still, and Audley Park is still alive and kicking.
Have you actually gone back to visit?
I went not so long ago because to make the whole deal work, there was some of the Audley Park is about 400 acres. It's huge. It's parkland, farmland, and science. But a relatively small portion towards the more historic end of the site, about 30 acres, was set aside for residential development, which helped the whole financial balance. So I did go back and have a look at the houses that were being built out of morbid curiosity as much as anything. But slightly outside my price range, as it turned out, Christina. So it was a fairly quick journey. But it was really interesting to see the place again. I met one or two familiar faces in the place. So the science end of the place looks and feels very much the same. The southern end of the site is obviously quite different, but that's how these things go.
And then after 15 years with AstraZeneca, then a shift to Firmenich.
Yep.
Now, Firmenich might not be a name that everybody knows as well as potentially AstraZeneca, but actually Firmenich touches so many of the products that we all consume and use every day. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Firmenich?
Oh, yeah, of course. Firmenich is an interesting organisation, as you say, because its business is built around a whole B2B model. The brand itself is not well known in the public eye, but if you think about the sort of three core parts of the business, flavours, consumer fragrance, and fine fragrance, there is very little on a day-to-day basis that people do that isn't in some way touched by a product that probably emanates from Firmenich, or if not, then from one of our competitors. So, you think about brushing your teeth in the morning. The minty taste is not in toothpaste by mistake. It's it's there. The cologne or the perfume that you put on, is clearly has a fine fragrance in it. Flavors in your breakfast cereals, your slice of toast, etc., all come from companies like Firmenich. So yeah, on a day-to-day basis, Firmenich probably touches as many people as pharmaceutical organizations, just in a different way. Interestingly, the thing about Firmenich, or the unique thing about Firmenich, is as well as being 125 years old this year, it is also still the largest privately owned fragrance and flavor house in the world, which has some interesting facets as a result. But it's a very I refer to it as a very big small company. It has revenues of touching $5 billion a year. It's a big organization.
Mm. And as you say, I think the fact that it's still privately owned, it doesn't mean that it's easier to have decisions approved, but you don't necessarily have the same structure and the shareholders in the same way. Are they still? Do they reside in Geneva? Is it in Geneva?
Yeah. So I mean, there's been a couple of changes in the last few years that are reasonably significant. So in about 2015. The CEO that was appointed then, who is still CEO now, was the first non-family member to be appointed as CEO. But Patrick Firmenich, who was the previous CEO, is still the chairman of the chairman of the company. So the name very much lives on. And I think you talk about decision making. I think that the decision making process within Firmenich is pretty rigorous and pretty robust. And perhaps not that different to many other organizations, but the thinking behind the decision making might be slightly different, because of course, as a privately owned company, slightly less at the beck and call of shareholders, etc. I mean, there are shareholders and they do expect a return on their investment, of course, but they're able to probably take a slightly longer term view. They're not in this for the short term. They're all still family members in some way, shape or form. So their interests are much longer term, and so that means that we do occasionally make investments that that may not have instantaneous or rapid returns, but make sense for the business in the longer term.
And so some of the metrics that other companies might use for investment decisions, we might be a little bit more flexible on because we may think it's the right thing to do, as well as just being a sound profit-making thing.
Mm. And how have the staff coped during this year, during the lockdown?
I would say overall, Christina, incredibly well. We've not, so Firmenich was able to maintain all of its manufacturing operations globally throughout the pandemic. So we, at no point were any of our manufacturing facilities impacted. Clearly, as a company that provides food materials into the food supply chain, and also if you think about the cleaning products and so on, we're quite an important supply chain to the world. So all the manufacturing facilities kept running all the way through. All the laboratory work, where a lot of the research is done and the application to develop new products, is also kept going. So they were what was considered our core or essential workers. So they were all in all the time. Everyone else, was, if you could work from home, please do work from home. And even today, we probably have only 30 to 40% of those roles occupying the office on a routine basis. So the organisation has continued. We've done things in our big locations like Princeton and Geneva. We've contributed something in the order of a couple of 100 tons of hand cleansing gels to hospitals and local medical areas to support the early stage of the pandemic. When that was in short supply, we were helping there because we were able to maintain our operation. So people are coping okay, I think. I think by and large, people are enjoying the opportunity to go back to the office, and some would like to go back more than they can. But we managed to keep things going all the time.
And was working from home already, part of the normal day to day for most of your staff before COVID, or was that a new?
I would say it was very much not the case, Christine. Within Firmenich, we had a policy, a flex work policy, which didn't really encourage or actively support working from home. It was quite, it was much more difficult than that. But with the learning from COVID, and in the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've actually developed, implemented, and published and released a kind of a new guideline on what we call smarter working, which actively enables and empowers people to make decisions about not just where they work, but also when they work. So for example, if somebody wanted to work from 10 in the morning till 8 at night rather than 9 to 5, that's fine. So it's a much more progressive and forward-thinking policy that puts the onus on delivery of results rather than where you deliver those results from. And I think that will really help people make decisions that support them and enable their lives in a more positive way.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I know we had a conversation about this earlier, and we're both agreed on that level. On a personal level, John, what have you done during COVID? Where have you been able to work, and what have been some of the positives and some of the negatives? What have you struggled with?
I consider myself in a pretty fortunate position. I've got room in the house where I can work in a pretty comfortable environment. I didn't have to perch on the end of a bed in a loft or anything like that. So I've been able to work from home. Both me and my wife have both been able to work from home throughout the pandemic. It was a bit more of a challenge when both the boys were not at school. It was a little bit of a fighting over bandwidth, but overall we coped okay. We managed to get away to the southwest a little bit over the time as well. So we were able to access outside space. We were able to spend time doing things. I know it wasn't the same for everybody, and I really feel for people in that situation. But personally, it was the lockdown was something we coped with okay. Which is probably a good thing, because it feels as though we might be about to have another one.
And looking forward, how often are you expected to go to work, and do you yearn to go back to the office? What do you think is going to be the new normal? Unfortunately, we've only got a minute left, so it's just.
I think the new normal. I travel quite a lot, Christine. I think I'll be traveling half the time. I'll be traveling to Geneva probably once a month rather than twice a month. New normal for going to the office, I think a couple of days a week is not going to be unusual for people.
That's how I see things developing from my side, and indeed for others.
Well, John, we've run out of time, but thank you. No, it's always fascinating talking to you, and love your insight, and love to hear how a bachelor in chemical engineering ended up as the vice president of global projects for a leading company in the world. So thank you for sharing those insights with us. Unfortunately, people can't clap, so I'll do a bit of clapping on. But thank you so much, and look forward to staying in touch. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye.